The theory of Darwinism, which has dominated science for the last 2 centuries, is fundamentally flawed. What Darwinism says is that the entirety of biological life, all of the complexity, all of the miracles, all consciousness, experience, coherence, the higher order coherence that life gives rise to, societies, everything is the result of random mutation, or the oxymoronic random selection. So in so doing, Darwinism neglects two of the causes which Aristotle laid out. Aristotle said that there was the material cause of the change, what is the substance of what is being changed, the efficient cause of the change, what is doing the change, what is actually changing it, but there's also the formal cause of the change and the final, which is what is the metaphysical pattern which generates the change, which generates the mutation, the selection which occurs over time, and what is the intrinsic purpose of the change. And what we find is that when we get into the metaphysical dimensions, and this is true not only of Darwinism but of most modern science, when you really pick it apart, it's vacuous and empty. It stands in silence to these questions. So science is confined to just the material and the efficient causes, what changes and what changes it. And when you take into account everything, this gives rise, at the very least, in Aristotle's metaphysics, which we'll later show is perfectly logically consistent, in fact, more so in some ways than modern scientific, at least the atheistic materialistic science, which dominates in some cases, it gives rise to the logical implication of that is you have a purposeful pattern-generating prime mover, which is Aristotle's definition of God as the source and the intrinsic purpose of the universe. But later, just to get back into the problems with Darwinism, the probability of the intersect between an evolutionary state, like the development of the human eye or the human brain or something even more complicated than that, the human body, all of this coming together in this marvelous coherence, the probability of the intersect of that state, we're going to bring in some probability theory, with the set of every possible state, everything in the entire world that could possibly happen, could possibly develop, is 0. So if you're saying that this is random selection, then you are essentially saying that a miracle occurs, 1 to quintillions odds. It's something extremely close to 0% for the likelihood of this level of complexity. Even the complexity of, let's say, a frog, still has, sensory motor abilities and, some sort of limited cognitive syntax and ability to interact with its environment. There's no actual mechanism to explain this because it neglects what's actually causing these life forms to generate. So, where the failure of acausality to explain this, or really much of anything, even outside the biological world, is afforded, we can conclude that it is far more likely that evolution is the function of some sort of intelligent design, whatever that may be, that the best way to explain the inherent complexity of the biological world is as the application of intelligence and design to complex systems over time. So Darwinism is a purely physical theory based on the almost trivial observation that nature imposes constraint on survival and reproduction. And it tries to extrapolate this to an entire model of biological causality. But it comes up short because it doesn't explain why those constraints are there, what's driving those constraints, what's the purpose of those constraints, what actually mediates the relationship between biological life and its environment. How does biological life emerge from nothingness, and how does the medium emerge of the natural environment? And it can't actually explain any of those. So it says that everything is survival of the fittest through random mutation. That's the entirety of evolution. And the odds of life arising through an ateleological mechanism, with very basic probability theory, you can chalk this up to 0%. So, what the CTMU, what Chris Langan says in his paper called Cheating the Millennium, the Mounting Explanatory Debts of Scientific Naturalism, where he actually goes and systematically lays out why Darwinism is flawed, both as scientific theory and as metaphysical theory, is that life and teleology are one and the same. This is what Carl Jung said, that life is teleology par excellence. It's a intrinsic striving towards a goal. And you can't account for what life actually is in the experience of the people who are living with a purely materialistic or mechanistic model, which excludes the symbolic, the moral, the metaphysical, the spiritual, the mental dimensions of existence and life. You just can't do that. And everyone kind of understands this, that when you're saying random selection, randomness is patternlessness. So you can't account for the astonishing complexity of the biological world or any other part of the world without a telos, without a purpose, without a model for self-organization and emergence through a higher order. And what Chris Langan posits is that the best way to explain this, and this is what's been classically known as the teleological argument for God, is that the best way to explain this emergence is as a higher natural and is a higher order supernatural and metaphysical designing intelligence which stands behind the universe, which precedes life and teleology itself. And that's what's usually called God. It's it's the creator of the heavens and the earth, means that you're actually creating the medium in which life can emerge, and then there's reciprocal feedback between the emanation of those divine energies with the actual medium through which life emerges as a function of that teleology. But Langan also does not reject Darwinism out of hand. So to save Darwinism, we need to, he says he actually finds Darwinism quite convincing, that it actually gives a model for how biological life adapts to its circumstances over the course of very long periods of time. But so to save Darwinism, we need to actually learn some model theory. So model theory separates theories from their universe and considers the mapping between the theories and their universes. And the theory is the subjective attribution of reality is what you can consider a theory. And the universe is reality itself. So when any theory is combined with the universe, it yields what Chris Langan calls a meta-object domain, which combines theory and universe. And which is then the new universe of reference, which can be studied with a new theory. So if you continue this regress, you end up with a theory which matches its universe. All of the rules and structures which apply to the theory apply to the universe, meaning that the theory is what actually generates the universe and allows for its rules and structures and vice versa. So the subjective and objective realms in this theory of theories, the regress of this is what's called a metalinguistic meta-object. So the terminus of this regress is the metalinguistic meta-object, which is an absolutely true identification of the universe, which dissolves the divide between model theory and universe, the subjective and objective, and language and universe. But all these go by the wayside when you actually have a proper attribution of reality. And so all of these are brought into coincidence. So cognition, theory, model, and universe. Cognitive theory being synonymous with cognitive theoretic language. So, And if you spell that out, it's CTMU. So Chris Langan actually has a model of such a theory, which syntactically is identified with its own universe of reference. It's a meta-object metadomain. It's the cognitive theoretic model of the universe by virtue of its closure. Its triadic identity as model theory in universe, or model cognitive theory in universe. So, which are the same. So by representing, so the universe, so by being its own language, universe, and model, the universe is able to talk to itself about itself in order to self-model. So there's actually a model of causation, and what that means is that when it's talking to itself, it's actually, there are two domains. There's the terminal domain and the non-terminal domain. And the terminal domain is what happens, and the non-terminal domain is all the processing that goes into that. So the processing domain, or the non-terminal domain, distributes based on those metalinguistic attributions and identifications, reality talking to itself about itself. Based on those communications, through its almost fractal structure, reality then distributes programming from the processing stage, which occurs as future potential, and then distributes programming back to the present in order to generate a timeline which maps a timeline, or a world line, more accurately, from the current state to a future state, which actually allows for a model of causation, but not only causation, but teleology. Because what is actually selecting for is the intrinsic self-utility of the universe, defined by the universe itself. So, utility is the name given to the attribute maximized by the rational choice function of the universe, which selects from an ontically generic form of its own being in order to self-actualize and self-identify itself. So the universe must generate and retrieve information on the intrinsic utility of its various possible forms that it may take. So potentials that obey the laws of nature are permitted to exist and are rendered fit, while potentials that are not are excluded. So through the CTMU's advanced model of causation, we actually end up with what the Chris Langan thus says the CTMU has a meta-Darwinian message, that the universe is actually, that there's not only natural selection occurring at the biological level, but there's a self-selection of nature for itself. So the universe is evolving by hological self-replication. It's constantly representing and recreating itself internally to itself in order for its own self-identification. So the universe evolves by hological self-replication and a cosmic form of natural selection, which takes into account all of nature, all of the metaphysical, symbolic, moral, teleological, mental, spiritual, physical, whatever. So it takes into account everything, and it's actually selecting from its own essence. So, the telic recursion, the self-selection parameter, is what's actually generating those evolutionary timelines. The patterns of emergence are essentially that what Langan would say is that the universe almost exploring itself for the purpose of its own self-identification to create ever fitter variants of itself internally to itself, so that when we actually consider Darwin's principle of natural selection in the context of a proper view of nature, it's not a function of random selection, but it's an act of purposeful design by God, by the global identity of all of reality, from which the divine energies to the universe flow, and then select for itself through this hological self-replication. So that actually turns out, so the divide between Darwinism and intelligent design turns out to be a false one when all is considered. So the universe, through biological evolution, is constantly scheming better and better ways to perceive itself, for the simple reason that these perceptions give rise to the universe through what the physicist John Wheeler, who actually coined the term black hole, he's a very important physicist in the 20th century who took an interest in Chris Langen's CTMU. But he calls this the self-excited circuit. So physics gives rise to observer participancy gives rise to physics, observer participancy gives rise to information, and information gives rise to physics. So it's a closed loop, or as Israeli poet Yehuda Halevi once opined, he said that, "I declare with perfect faith that God created humans, humans created prayer, and prayer created God." And that isn't technically correct, but it is analogous to what, and I actually think that's somewhat of a blasphemous statement, but that aside, it's analogous to what's happening through the telic feedback between these acts of observer participation and the laws of physics and quantum information, that there's this feedback loop which is actually generating these timelines through that self-selection. So perception here is generalized to observer participancy in the vein of YouTuber Coronius Focus, who's done a number of videos on the CTMU, that perception is essentially what biological evolution is selecting for. And the reason it's doing this, if you consider this broad view of nature that the CTMU allows for, is that perception here is generalized to observer participancy. So perception is the ability to interact with the universe in a way which produces positive results across iterations. And the purpose of human life and biological life in general, the human, which is the current terminus of that, is to the logos, which is the language by which the universe actually self-models, which is the human representation of which is truthful perception manifested within the universe as a creative and regenerative force. Forming the bedrock of ethical action is the logos, is the actual self-identification of reality as the telos of biological evolution, which then the sum of all of that throughout all of time and all of the universe actually gives rise to the universe itself. It's a closed loop. So Chris Langen says two things of note. So then that retroactively creates the universe. So he says two things of note. That first, that everything begins as internal reality and then is externalized through perception. So external reality couldn't exist without these acts of observer participancy, which are then retroactively externalizing and representing and creating the universe in the consciousness of observer participants. And secondly, that the ethical instinct towards embodying the logos, and he says this is represented by the figure of Jesus Christ, is that it represents, but the ethical instinct towards embodying the logos, towards embodying truthful perception manifested within the universe, represents a spiritual kind of speciation whereby the human species can regeneratively evolve into a higher one, into a more evolved species. So the question, will this occur, is still an open question. We're still not the most highly evolved species we could be, and this is quite obvious. But if it does occur, then if it can still occur, then the intrinsic utility of mankind is still salvageable, and we can inaugurate the kingdom of heaven upon earth. And that is the promise of the CTMU. That is the intelligent design which the universe is selecting for, is that potential, but it's still up to us to actualize that. So let it be soon in our times, sooner than we can imagine. Let the light shine forth from the darkness. May the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Peace.